Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Chris Jacobs. I'm the Executive Director of Pinewoods Camp located in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And I also want to introduce Beth Reagan, our Assistant Manager of Communications and Operations and Communications. Beth is thankfully running tech tonight. So thank you, Beth. And I also want to say welcome, and we are so excited because we are celebrating Pinewood's centennial year this 2025. And we have tons of activities planned throughout the year. And Beth is going to drop in the chat the link to our centennial activities. I also want to give a special thank you to our board of directors and especially to Michael Warshaw and Joe Rossi, our co-chairs for the Centennial Committee. And then there's a whole host of individuals that are working behind the scenes on various committees to bring all these activities to fruition. So thank you. It's going to be a great year, which brings us to our first event, which is the Winter Zoom series, Bringing Pinewoods to Life. And before I introduce our speakers, we're going to hold questions till the end. But in the meantime, if you do have questions throughout, you can drop them into the chat and we'll put them in queue for the at the end for the Q&A period. And so with no further ado, I am going to introduce our two speakers presenting Helen Storrow, Pinewoods Camp and the first Girl Scout Training School. Our speaker is Francine Edwards, one of the co-founders of the Girl Scout Museum at Cedar Hill, which is located in Waltham, Massachusetts. Francine spent 8 glorious summers during the late 1940s and early 1950s at Camp Four Winds on Long Pond. She was a camper, a kitchen worker, and eventually the waterfront counselor teaching swimming, boating, and canoeing. A current museum volunteer, Francine has special interest in Helen Storrow and the early history of Girl Scouting in Massachusetts. And assisting Francine tonight, we have Lynn Saunders Cutter. Lynn is the volunteer project manager at the Girl Scout Museum at Cedar Hill in Waltham. She is passionate about the mission of Girl Scouts, which is to build girls of courage, confidence, and character who make the world a better place. She is a former troop leader, former board member of the Girl Scouts of Eastern Massachusetts, and a lifetime Girl Scout. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. So thank you again.
Okay, wait a second. Okay, I'm going to share the screen. So don't start until I get it. And I am the technical person. That is pretty funny, but all right. And wait a second. Okay. All right.
Okay. Well, thank you so very much for your invitation to be able to share the story of the first National Girl Scout Training School, and especially the role of Helen Osborne Storrow. She was a remarkable woman. She was a woman of great energy, vision, and philanthropic efforts. We're only able to make this production possible due to the extensive archival collection of documents and artifacts at the Girl Scout Museum at Cedar Hill in Waltham, Massachusetts. Due to the foresight of early Girl Scouts and the frugal nature of New Englanders, we have one of the largest collections in the country. The Girl Scout Museum at Cedar Hill opened in 1983. We had a one-room venue and an annual budget of $100. But we were able to exhibit quite a lot of artifacts, and many Girl Scout troops came to visit. We eventually received a grant from the Dennett Foundation, and in 1989, we were able to build a small museum on the property. It was like a dream came into reality. We later received a large anonymous donation and undertook a renovation and expansion project to update and enlarge the museum. building. The expanded museum held its grand opening in October of 2017. We have a lot more room for exhibits. And the second floor, we have a lot of office space and research space. Now, my own personal experience in Girl Scouts, and especially at Camp Four Winds, was a wonderful time for me. I was a city kid, and I grew up in Brookline, which is contiguous to Boston, and the part of Brookline that was rather densely populated community. And in addition to this, I had never been away from home before. So it was exciting for me to be introduced to learning the names of trees, how to identify spruce from fir, learning different species of snakes and birds. I'd never even seen a snake before. I'd never slept outdoors, and at Camp Four Winds, I slept in a tent right next to the lake. It was great. Among the camping skills I learned at Four Winds, the skill that had the most influence on my life was learning to swim. When I went back home, I pursued my swimming. I lived only 3 blocks from the town municipal pool, and I started going there 2 or 3 times a week. This gave me the opportunity to join the amateur athletic union, in which I was able to compete with girls from other swimming pools. It was a wonderful experience, and it never would have happened had I not learned to swim at Four Winds. I also learned boating and canoeing at camp. This may have been a factor in my deciding to join a Mariner troop of Girl Scouts when I entered high school. In Mariners, we studied sea, rules of the sea. We did channel markers, buoys. We learned Morse code. And we study meteorology. It's important to know what your weather's going to be when you're going sailing. And I still continued my swimming. As a matter of fact, when I was determining which college I wanted to attend, one of the major factors in my decision was that they had a fabulous swimming pool. And this choice enabled me to become a member of the synchronized swimming team in college, which was a lot of fun, a lot of hard work, a lot of discipline, and I loved it. I happened to visit Camp Four Winds about 30 years ago. 30 years later. In the early 1980s, Pat Ross, co-founder of the museum, and I went to the Four Winds property, which was still in trust after the sale by Girl Scouts. We also visited Ed Wilford, the self-appointed archivist of Pinewoods Camp. In the 1970s, Ed started collecting and preserving the many documents and photos that chronicle the histories of the properties, including the first National Training School. Who knew when I was a teenager that I would end up with all these Long Pond connections? Let's take a look at the life of Helen Osborne Storrow. Helen was born in Auburn, New York in 1864, the youngest of 4 children. Her family was rather well known in the community. As a matter of fact, her father had been elected mayor for a couple of terms. They were involved in the Underground Railroad. I don't know if you're familiar with the escaped slave Harriet Tubman, who kept going back south and bringing people north that had escaped from slavery. As a matter of fact, Helen's aunt had married William Lloyd Garrison, Jr., son of the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Also, her grandmother was involved in the suffrage movement. Auburn wasn't that far from Seneca Falls, so she got involved with those women. Helen was sent away to boarding school at the age of 11. She was very interested in music, and she later continued her musical studies in Germany. She graduated from Smith College. In all her life, Henry was interested in keeping healthy and fit. She loved the outdoor life, especially hiking. As a matter of fact, she met her future husband while hiking. Helen was hiking the Matterhorn in Switzerland. So was her brother Thomas, with one of his friends from Harvard, James Jackson Storrow. They met on a mountain trail and realized they had a lot in common. Here's a photo of James and Helen out canoeing. In 1891, James Storrow, they married. James Storrow was part of a Brahmin family of very wealthy Bostonians. He was involved in many philanthropies, as was Helen. So they were very compatible. Now, the Boston Public Library was holding club meetings for young women, especially immigrants. And in 1901, Helen got involved with a group of older girls that met on Saturday evenings. Helen realized that these immigrant girls needed to learn a skill in order to make a living. So she bought a house on Hull Street in the North End of Boston in 1908. And she founded and financed a pottery company where the girls learned to paint, glaze, and fire the pottery. Since this was located near the Paul Revere House in the North End, they called it Paul Revere Pottery. And this pottery is extremely collectible today. You'll find pieces of it in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and in the Cape Ann Museum. And we have a few pieces here in the Girl Scout Museum. The founder of Girl Scouts was a woman named Juliet Gordon Lowe. She lived in Savannah, Georgia. She married an Englishman named Willie Lowe and moved to England. There she met Robert Baden-Powell, the founder of Boy Scouts. His wife and his sister wanted the girls to experience the same kind of activities that the boys were experiencing. So they started Girl Guides. Juliet was intrigued with this, and she started running troops herself. She ran troops in Scotland and in England. And when Juliet came back to the United States, she started a troop in 1912, and she called them Girl Scouts instead of Girl Guides. Now, Juliet had a cousin named Percy Gordon, who was a minister in the Boston area. Percy knew of a woman named Emma Hall in New Bedford and said to his cousin Juliet, "I think this woman might be interested in your movement." So Juliet wrote a letter to Emma and asked if she could visit her in New Bedford. We have that letter in our museum. Emma certainly said yes, and they became good friends. Emma started a troop in New Bedford and called it the Red Rose Troop. It was started in 1913. It was the first troop in Massachusetts, and it was the third troop formed in the whole of the United States. Now, in 1915, Helen was invited to a meeting in Boston and was introduced to the Girl Scout movement. Troops were being formed, and Helen loved the idea of teaching girls to experience outdoor activities: hiking, swimming, outdoor cooking, woodcraft, folk dancing, all the activities that Helen enjoyed herself. She started a troop in Lincoln, Mass, near her country home. She led that troop for many years, and we have a few photos of Helen with her troop. And this actually was taken at the dock at Pine Tree Point on Long Pond. And I believe they're spelling out an S for Storrow. And we have other pictures. This is Mrs. Storrow's Lincoln troop at Pine Tree Camp. And we have a couple more photos. There they are. Helen began to think about training for Girl Scout leaders. She had local leaders come to her house in Lincoln, and they would talk over their experiences, what they were doing. And they also had drills. And here's a photo of them drilling at her house in Lincoln. To try out this idea of a training for leaders, Helen sent two women, Olive Leslie and Margaret Sutherland, to the property that she owned called Pine Tree Point located on Long Pond in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And Helen was reflecting on this in an article that she wrote in June of 1930. She sent them there with the intention of holding what had never been tried up to that time, a training camp for Girl Scout officers. The movement was still in its infancy here, and most officers had trained with the help of the Little Blue Handbook, which Juliette Lowe had written. The two women experienced many adversities, including the fact that their equipment did not arrive until 3 days later. And Helen writes, at last, after 3 days, their goods arrived. The tents were pitched. 12 to 16 Girl Scout leaders came to be instructed, and the very first Girl Scout leader training school came into being on Long Pond. Olive and Margaret were greatly helped by a man named John Raymond, who lived in the area. Over the years, Helen and John became very good friends. This is a picture of them at Long Pond in Plymouth. During the training, John took care in teaching the women woodcraft, and he led them on hikes. Here's a picture of John teaching the women. He also constructed some buildings on the site. Helen actually wrote lyrics to a spiritual song titled Come, My Brother, in appreciation for all the help that John gave at Pine Tree for many years. John Raymond built us all a camp. He built it near a Plymouth swamp. The Ware rose till they came to the door, and we found ourselves on Long Pond shore. Come along, come along, come along to Long Pond shore. Come along, come along, coming along to Long Pond's shore. The year after this experiment, a national training school for Girl Scout leaders opened at Miss Windsor's School in Boston. There were 51 applicants, and this was the summer of 1917. There were some day students. It was met with much enthusiasm by many, and dignitaries actually came, including Juliette Lowe, her cousin, Nina Pope, and of course, Emma Hall. The camp was run by Helen Storrow, and it was run in a military-style regimen. And we have to think historically when this was. We were right in the middle of World War I. The women wore khaki uniforms. They practiced marching and drills, along with the campcraft, outdoor cooking, tent living. They learned swimming and folk dancing. Many of the activities. Some of the most interesting ones were the fire department came, and they taught these women how to escape a burning building. And I just love these photos, particularly here on the right-hand side, where the lady's jumping out of a second-story window and all the leaders are going to catch her below. The Girl Scout Museum at Cedar Hill has a collection of letters written by participants in that 1917 training camp. Helen was much admired. Grace Lingham wrote in her letter, impressed indelibly upon their minds are the dignity, tact, and thoughtfulness of their honored commandant, who spent the entire time in camp caring for the comfort of the scouts. Grace also told that Helen modestly declared that the school was, and she quotes, a magnificent example of the valor of ignorance. And I love that quote. It shows Helen's wonderful sense of humor. Incidentally, during World War I, their large home in Lincoln, Mass, they lent it to the government to be used as a convalescent home for wounded soldiers. There was the main house and some outbuildings. It consisted of 16 acres with gardens and woods. In 1918, the second year of training remained at the Windsor School. All of the students who came were instructed in the same activities as the year before, with the addition of map reading, storytelling, and they were also offered instructions in bugling and drumming. In her memories of this training camp, Grace Lingham writes again, folk songs and folk dancing were taught by one who probably knew more about English folklore than any man, Cecil B. Sharp, who was assisted by one of his most capable students, Mrs. Emma Gibbs. This hour was greatly enjoyed. Now, these leaders brought the love of dance back to their troops, and dancing became quite popular among the Girl Scout troops. In fact, the Girl Scouts often held rallies, and this is a flag from one of the rallies in 1918, a folk dancing rally. At the end of the 1918 sessions, the decision was made to move the training school to Long Pond. So in August of 1918, Helen took a couple of leaders to Pine Tree Point to help her select the appropriate spot for the training school, which was to convene in the summer of 1919. This is a photo of Helen at her cabin on Pine Tree Point. One of these women, named Flora Mundy, had been there before and had met Lily Roberts, who had come from England to help Cecil Sharp. And she wrote, "At the moment of my arrival, I made the acquaintance of Lily Roberts, and she made a picture that will always remain with me. Straight and slim, in khaki blouse and knickers, a green ribbon tied about her head, she stood against an oak tree, poised on one foot, the other lightly crossed over it, and her hands clasped above her head. Truly the spirit of the oak incarnate. It was from her during the next few days that I learned about Mr. Sharp's wonderful work in collecting and reviving the old folk songs and dances of England. And Mrs. Storrow had left some of the famous red books, and there was an extraordinary musical instrument, a little wheezy organ affair that folded up and went into a suitcase. So that we had much music and learned many songs which we still enjoy singing." Lily Roberts and Helen became good friends. Lily met Richard Conant at a harvest festival dance at the Storrow home. And Lily and Richard were married in the parlor of the Storrow home. And Cecil Sharp gave away the bride. Richard served in France as a lieutenant during World War I, but when he returned, the Conants moved to the Storrow property in Lincoln. In 1919, the first National Training School for Girl Scout leaders opened at Pine Tree Camp on Long Pond. There were 60 participants registered, despite the feeling of some leaders that it was too far away and people may not come. But it turned out to be a great success. Helen's interest in dance was inspired by her trips to Europe, especially England, where she developed a passion for folk dancing. She became a devotee of Cecil Sharp and helped him to popularize folk dance in the United States. In 1915, she helped found and became director of the American branch of the English Folk Dance Society. She believed that everyone's life could be enhanced by dancing. We have photos of dancing at her home we see here in Lincoln. We also have photos of Helen in a Morris dance participating at Cedar Hill in Waltham. Building on her philosophy about dance, she arranged for teachers from the Country Dance Society to organize a summer dance camp at Long Pond. This camp operated independently alongside Pine Tree Girl Scout Leaders Training School for many years. In 1923, Helen was instrumental in obtaining 75 acres from Cornelia Warren's estate in Waltham, including an 18-room house with barns and wooded property, and she financed the restoration of the old farmhouse and other buildings on the site known as Camp Cedar Hill. She turned the dairy barn, which used to house 100 cows, into a meeting hall. Camp Cedar Hill celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2023. It is the hub of our Girl Scout Council, Girl Scouts of Eastern Massachusetts. And it's also the site of a summer day camp and troop camping year-round. Helen's work in the Girl Scout movement was the impetus for her being elected the first vice president of Girl Scouts of the USA in 1920. The second vice president at the time was Lou Henry Hoover, wife of the future president, Herbert Hoover. In fact, Lou Henry Hoover visited Pine Tree Camp in 1922. She can be seen in this photo on the left, along with Sarah Louise Arnold, the first dean of Simmons College, now Simmons University. Ms. Arnold also served as the national president of Girl Scouts from 1925 to 1928. Helen's election as first vice president was just one of the many positions she held in Girl Scouts. She served as the chairman of Massachusetts Girl Scouts, and she had a great interest in international Girl Scout and Girl Guides and was involved in organizing the World Association of Girl Scouts and Girl Guides, which still exists today. Helen was elected chairman of this World Committee in 1928. Now, Helen had an idea about having a place where Girl Scouts and Girl Guides from all over the world could come and meet and share experiences and cultures. She found a perfect spot in Adelboden, Switzerland, and had a large chalet built. This first World Center was dedicated in 1932, and attending the dedication were none other than her good friends, Lily and Richard Conant. This chalet still hosts girls and Girl Scouts and Girl Guides from all over the world. The highest award in Great Britain is called the Silver Fish, and it has only been given to people outside of Great Britain 3 times. The first was in 1919, it was awarded to Juliette Gordon Low, and here's a picture of her wearing the Silver Fish. In 1921, Helen Osborne Storrow and Anne Hyde Choate, 2 other Americans, were awarded the Silver Fish. And this is a great picture of Helen and Anne Hyde Choate at Pine Tree Camp. I wonder what Helen's going to do with that shovel. Juliette's silver fish was buried with her, but Helen's is on display at the Girl Scout Museum at Cedar Hill. And this is a photo of her world uniform, and you can see the silver fish. She wore it everywhere. Now, aside from the land at Pine Tree Point, Helen had purchased other pieces of property on Long Pond and Gallows Pond. These properties were used for Girl Scout camps, and we'll take a look at them. Camp Four Winds was an 85-acre camp, which opened in 1926, and is adjacent to Pine Tree, which is now Pinewoods Camp. In 1937, 150 Four Winds campers visited Pine Tree Camp to welcome international visitors. They were treated to a demonstration of English folk dancing by a group under the leadership of Mr. Kennedy, who at that time was president of the English Folk Dance Society. The whole encampment from both Pine Tree and Four Winds were bused to the seashore for an old-fashioned New England clam bake. We can see girls gathering seaweed, and the people dug pits in the sand in order to cook the food. And on top of the coals, the seaweed was put, the wet seaweed, so that they could steam the food, which included clams, lobsters, corn, sweet potatoes, salad, and juicy watermelon. Sounds great. I wish I'd been there. In 1964, Massachusetts Girl Scouts sold Camp Four Winds to the Blue Hills Girl Scout Council, and they changed the name to Camp Dorothy Carleton. The property was eventually sold by the Girl Scouts to local residents rather than them selling to developers. I'd like to share with you just a couple of memories I have of the 8 summers that I spent at Camp Four Winds. The 2 years that I was a kitchen worker, and I want to point out that this is the back of the dining hall. Those steps go up into the kitchen. And at that time, I can distinctly remember we had the milk delivered in those huge metal milk containers. This is the front of the dining hall. It also had an office and a counselor's room there. This is the interior of the dining hall. Well, my cousin Eleanor and I worked in the kitchen, and we shared a 2-person tent on a knoll in the Young Adventurers unit on the borderline of Pinewoods Camp. We could hear the music coming from Pinewoods Camp. But at that time, I had no idea of its history or of its connection with either Four Winds or Helen Storrow. I knew none of that. One of my favorite memories as a counselor, this was in 1953, was leading an overnight canoe trip. I was responsible for getting all the food supplies and equipment and making sure the girls had what they needed to take on our great adventure. And we'll see a map here, and most of the property that you see along Long Pond and part of Gallows Pond were actually owned by Helen Storrow. So we had 5 canoes filled with campers and equipment. It was an amazing trip. We paddled about a mile up Long Pond to the creek that connects Long Pond to Little Long Pond. Then we crossed Little Long Pond and portaged our canoes overland and the equipment to Gallows Pond. Then we paddled across Gallows Pond and camped out on the shore. We gathered wood and cooked our supper. We slept on the ground in blanket rolls that we had made because sleeping bags weren't readily available back then. In the morning, we cooked our breakfast, made sure the campfire was totally extinguished, packed up, and reversed our travels. When I think of it now, it's amazing to me that I was given this responsibility to lead this group of Girl Scouts. I had just turned 17 years old at the time. It was only when I started working at the museum and looked at maps of the Six Ponds area that I realized that we had camped on Girl Scout property. But at the time, I had no clue. I'm sure I must have been supervised without my knowledge. But this experience sticks in my mind as a very important step in my life because it helped to give me the confidence in my leadership abilities. By the way, the director, whom I admired very much, the director of Camp Four Winds, all the years I was there and many years after that, was Edith M. Buckler. And she had attended one of Helen Storrow's National Training School for Girl Scout leaders at Long Pond. Camp Wind in the Pines opened in 1929. It was originally a 17-acre site, which was a state camp for intermediate Girl Scouts. And in 1935, it became a tent camp for girls aged 14 to 18. It emphasized water activities and horseback riding. In 1976, an additional 125 acres were purchased to augment the camp size. Camp Wind in the Pines is still thriving as both an overnight camp and a day camp in the summer, and troop camping all year round. The designation of Wind in the Pines as a Lou Henry Hoover Memorial Sanctuary by Girl Scouts of the USA will preserve in perpetuity its rich resources for the future. Now we come to Camp Helen Storrow. This was 35 acres. It was the Elwell property purchased by Helen Storrow in 1925. It was used by campers of different age groups depending on the needs of the council. Some interesting items about Camp Helen Storrow. Poet Sylvia Plath spent 2 summers on Long Pond at the camp in 1945 and 1946. She was already writing poetry, as well as keeping a diary, and she sent glowing letters of her camp experience to her parents. The Morgan Library and Museum in New York has a poems manuscript that Sylvia made in 1946, and this includes several references to her experience at Camp Helen Storrow. Now, Helen had also purchased land on Martha's Vineyard and given it to the Girl Scouts for use as a sailing camp. But for safety reasons, during World War II, the Vineyard Sailing Camp was moved to Camp Storrow, and they did their sailing on Long Pond. They had 6 sloops, which must have been a wonderful sight to see on that beautiful pond. Camp Helen Storrow was sold in the 70s to local people. Now let's take a look back at Pine Tree Camp. In 1933, Mrs. Storrow offered Pine Tree Camp as a permanent home for the American branch of the English Folk Dancing Society, and she left the care of the property to her friend, Lily Conant. The sharing of the property between folk dance and Girl Scout leaders training continued until 1935, when the training school moved to a new site. So in 1935, where did the Girl Scout Leaders Training School go? It seemed to be a mystery. But in our museum, we have copies of the deeds to the properties that Helen gifted to the Girl Scouts. And as seen in this picture, the deeds say Camp Helen Storrow, formerly Pine Tree Camp. And this was confusing because we knew that this property was not the property that we knew the original Pine Tree Camp was located. However, with further research, we found an article in a 1935 camp brochure that explained that the Elwell property, which Helen had purchased in 1925, had been made into a new Pine Tree Camp, which opened in 1935. I'd like to share a couple of excerpts from here. The first national training school at Plymouth, Massachusetts, had, in its popularity, grown beyond the limits of Pine Tree Camp. Mrs. Storrow, interested in having the best possible training for leaders and sponsors of the Girl Scouts, has had built an entire new camp. This is on an unusually lovely site on the southeastern shore of Long Pond, where the land rises up to face blue water, stretching 1.5 miles toward the sunset. And the other excerpt. John Raymond, whose ancestors lived in the same land for generations, has been the architect and builder. He works without blueprint or sketch, using the instincts of the early American builders, whose sense of proportion and simplicity of line created a style of architecture which has stood the test of time. The camp house, quite typically Cape Cod, with a generous fireplace within and a broad porch without, will be the center of the leisurely camp life. To one side, the land rises, and on the highest point among the pine trees stands C Sharp, dedicated in memory of Cecil Sharp to folk dancing and folk song, and now also to a most glorious view of rolling lands, trees, lake, and sandy shores. Helen died in 1944 and left Pinewoods Camp to Lily and Richard Conant. And with the death of Lily in 1973 and Richard in 1975, the property went to their son, Rick. And as the Pinewoods website says, he encouraged the creation of a nonprofit to which the camp could be sold. Pinewoods is the oldest continuing folk dance camp in the United States, and it was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2009. After Helen's death in 1944, the new Pine Tree Camp's name was changed to Camp Helen Storrow, so our mystery was solved. Now let's take a look at some of the older pictures of Pine Tree Camp in its early years. This is a national publication of Girl Scouts called The Rally. And in it, they had a big spread in 1919 of the first national training school at Pine Tree Camp. This shows the tents in 1919. There's Helen on the right. I think she's doing an inspection there. And here is, we mentioned Flora Mundy. Here she is in the call to the colors when they're raising the flag. I love this one. On the left, it's Helen in her office. It's very rustic. These are some of the children of the leaders who came to be instructed at the camp. And on the right, we'll see a picture of Mrs. Storrow's niece. She was also there at the camp. And here we see her niece again, and they're learning how to make model lean-tos, and we'll see a full lean-to later on. This is a great picture. On the left is Sarah Louise Arnold, first Dean of Simmons, and also president of National Girl Scouts for a couple of years. In the middle is Emma Hall, first troop in Mass and third troop in the United States from New Bedford. And on the right is Helen Storrow in one of her favorite camp outfits. Here we see Mrs. Arnold down on the shore, watching the boating, canoeing, and there are some scouts looking out, overlooking. This is one of the international visitors. Her name was Peggy Pryor. She was a girl guide from Britain. They'd had quite a few international visitors come. Here's a view of the training school in 1919. And another view, you can see they're building some more buildings. It's growing. And this is the office at Pine Tree Camp. And there are some people, and it looks like they have a truckload of lumber, probably going to build some more buildings there. On the left is the dining pavilion, and on the right are some cabins where people would live. Here's another view of the dining pavilion in the camp house. This was taken in the 1920s, early 20s. And this view is from 1926. It doesn't seem to change too much. There's a bugle call at the Pine Tree Camp. And here they're getting ready to go swimming. Marion Moreland not only was a bugler, but she also wrote some songs that campers still sing. I mean, that Girl Scouts still sing. And there she is on the right doing the swimming call, calling the girls, it's time to go for our swim. Here's a group of leaders on the shores of Pine Tree Camp. This again is in 1919. And here's the interior, that nice fireplace, the camp house. And we believe that this next picture was staged to go into the rally brochure. It shows them cleaning up the campsite. This was the storeroom at Pine Tree Camp and the garage. And we think that is Mrs. Storrow's automobile. We can see Mrs. Storrow on the left with that her Great Dane is beside her, so you can pick her out. She's in her dress uniform there. I think they're eating outdoors. They cooked outdoors too, by the way. Breakfast in the sun. And now they have a tent fly over protecting them in case it's inclement weather. And here they're in the dining pavilion. So this was a few years later, 24 or 25. Here they're working on a handywoman badge. So they're doing repairs. And on the right, it's Ann Hyde Choate, Mrs. Choate, learning to grind an axe. And why did they need axes? Why? To chop wood. And here's a woman ready to take a big swing. And there she is, chopping the wood. And they're sawing the wood into sizable pieces that they can handle well. And they had a terrifically large wood pile but let's remember they had to do all their cooking on wood fire. Filling the kerosene lanterns, no electricity there. And yet I can remember when I was at camp, we had the exact same kerosene lanterns. And that was in the late 40s, early 50s. Here's Marion Moreland building a model fire. And this is Mr. Templeton teaching fire building in 1920. And we have another view of Mr. Templeton helping, and they've gotten the fire going pretty well. And here they are. Looks like they've got everything going there. This is an overnight hike, and they camped out on the shores of one of the lakes. I'm not sure which one. There they are building fires again. They remember they had to do all their cooking on outdoor fires. And this was passing the fire test for second-class rank. And this is the lean-to shelter in its full size. We saw them building a model earlier. Here's swimming on Long Pond. And another view of swimming. And in this next picture, the lake looks pretty high that year, swimming. And you can see the lifeguard standing on the dock, directing the girls. And this is life-saving practice. It's much safer to throw a rope and tow somebody in than to go in and get them yourself. And here they're doing resuscitation practice, just in case they need to do life-saving. Here are the canoes. And I love these war canoes, the large canoes. They had around 10 people paddling them. Here's another view of the war canoes on Long Pond. Semaphore, or signaling, was quite popular back then. And you had to be adept with those flags to spell out letters. You had to be in line of sight to communicate with anybody. And there's rifle practice with John Raymond on the left, teaching the women how to fire rifles. They did map making, which was very important at the time. And they're learning more skills in their map making. And of course, having eaten all those meals now, you have to wash the dishes. So we have a few shots here of the people tidying up. And you notice they're all in full uniform doing all of these chores. Very interesting to see. I want to thank you for this opportunity to share some snippets of the life of the remarkable Helen Osborne Storrow, and particularly her involvement with the American branch of the English Country Dance Society, as well as her immense contributions to Girl Scouts. I'd also like to thank the volunteers at the Girl Scout Museum at Cedar Hill, who helped to gather the photos and documents from our collection in preparation for this presentation. And I especially want to thank Lynn Saunders Cutter, who worked tirelessly to put together and run this PowerPoint of photos from this presentation. Thank you, Lynn.
Wow. Thank you so much, Francine. Thank you, Lynn. That was an amazing presentation. And I've got to see it a second time, and I saw you added a few more slides, and it's just fabulous. So thank you. Thank you for being here tonight. And just before we open this up to questions, the Q&A period, I just want to remind folks that we have another session of the Bringing Pinewoods History to Life on March 25th. It'll be the second of a three-part series, and that's the Conant family in Pinewoods. So Beth is going to drop that link into the website, so we hope you can join us. And I know we have some of the Conant family here watching this Zoom, and Francine talked about the Conants. So come join us on March 25th. And then Francine, and Lynn, if someone wants to come and join or come visit the Girl Scout Museum at Cedar Hill. What is the process for that?
Well, we're an all volunteer organization, so there's no paid staff. So you have to make an appointment, but it's easy to do. You can either look on the website of Massachusetts, Girl Scouts of Eastern Massachusetts, and look under the museum, and either email us or call, and we'll make sure a volunteer is there to give you a tour. We are here every Tuesday and Thursday. Someone is normally here working. That's the 2 work days that we choose, but you can come any other time.
Great. And I think you can also support all these wonderful archival materials as well, correct?
Yes, indeed. We welcome donations. We welcome artifacts, and we welcome monetary donations that will help us get supplies.
And we also always encourage people to think about donating to the council. We have a campership fund that lets girls come to our camps, one of which is Wind in the Pines on Gallows Pond. So I think Beth was going to maybe put the links in the chat for our museum page and also the donation page, which you should be able to find the information that you need.
Yes, so she just dropped those in.
Oh, good.
And I want to remind folks, I know a lot of folks couldn't be here right when we started. So if you weren't able to be here or you want to watch it again, this will be posted to our YouTube channel. It'll probably take us about a week to process and get up there. And then subsequently, it'll be on our website. And it will be also go out on the ANA. So you'll be able to see this again, and Francine, you'll be famous. So
And so will Lynn.
yeah, and so also just a reminder, we have lots of centennial activities happening. Visit our website and pinewoods.org /centennial. And if you'd like to make a donation to the Pinewood Centennial activities, again, we have a lot going on, and you can use that link that Beth is dropping into into the chat. Now with that, we're going to open Q&A. So you can ask questions one of 2 ways, and just remember, you're still being recorded. So you can either ask it by dropping a note into the chat feature, and we'll put those in queue. But you can also use the react button, which is the little heart at the bottom of the video of the Zoom, and you can use the raise hand feature. And so Beth and I will try and keep track of all those questions. And so who has a question for Francine and Lynn?
Hopefully no questions.
Well, someone did say that they love your presentation and then their mom attended Four Winds in the 40s.
Oh,
It was great to see this.
you could
So
have been my tent mate.
Yeah.
Nice.
it looks like Mark has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I did put this in the chat. You showed this training in escaping from a burning building. And I wonder if this was something that was done with the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire in mind. It was a few years after the fire happened.
It's a very interesting point. That could well be, because it was really part of their curriculum on those training, both 1917, 1918 at Miss Windsor School for sure.
Yeah, and we do have some documents, letters that Helen wrote organizing the camp, and letters back from the fire department, kind of arranging everything. And I will say that one of the letters afterwards, they told Mrs. Storrow that the Girl Scouts were more organized than the Boy Scouts about fire safety. So we did like that, although we love the Boy Scouts too. But yeah, I mean, she was very much wanted to make sure that the adults had training
Yes.
and everything.
As a matter of fact, she had her house in Lincoln built solely of brick to prevent fire.
If I can get another one in, um, there's been a lot of controversy in recent years about Cecil Sharp. Uh, Apparently, he was uh, quite a racist. Um, did Helen Storrow ever have any reaction to that or comment on it or
We we actually don't know. I mean, I would say that she was very careful about curating her image. Her husband, was a business person, and we've never seen anything. We didn't really know that much about Cecil. We did learn how to say his name correctly, so that was good. Um, but when we started reading more, he's a pretty interesting character, controversial in many ways. And so we hope someone will do a Zoom about Cecil because we really didn't know that much about him before we started
No.
this, but we haven't seen any documentation, um, you know,
No,
but
I haven't come
yeah,
across anything.
but we've tried to find things about Helen, like if she was involved in the suffrage movement. And, we're not academics, but it's been very hard to find. Her quotes were all curated pretty much.
Yeah. Well, James was not crazy about the suffrage movement, so she kind of distanced herself. She had plenty of other things going on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
is she the
All right.
person after whom Storrow Drive is named?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. We have a question in the chat from David Millstone. Another important figure in creating organizations to support girls in developing outdoor skills and dancing was Luther Halsey Gulick, who was among the founders of the Campfire Girls around 1910. Do we know of any contacts between Mrs. Storrow and Dr. Gulick?
I have not come across his name in all the research that we've done.
No. We know that there was kind of a between the Campfire Girls and Girl Scouts. And during that time, there's a whole history of kind of the organizations fighting for using the names and controversy with taking the program from England. There's a whole study in that, but I've never heard that
No.
name. Interesting. But we do have a disclaimer. We are not academics.
Exactly.
We have not written a dissertation, although sometimes it feels like it. We're just people who are passionate about history and Girl Scouts. And now all of the Six Ponds, both of us have really enjoyed working on this for that reason.
Great. And Marnie has her hand raised. And Marnie, I have to say thank you because when we were discussing what we were going to do for the Winter Zoom series, we had this idea and you reached out to the museum, the Girl Scout Museum at Cedar Hill. So thank you, Marnie. And I see you have a question.
Thank you. I am so excited to meet the two of you, and thank you so much for the work that you put in and the images that you brought to us and the information you brought to us. It's profound, and I'm going to go back and watch this again and probably again and again. So I love that this is now preserved for us, and I can't thank you enough. I was delighted to see the early. I forget what year it was, but it was the year that you had this celebration of one of the later versions of the museum when you had girls in all different uniforms.
Yes, they were wearing through the year.
And it was a truly racially integrated community. And I know from my research that for Helen Storrow, that was important. And I have been curious about what it was like for her because she grew up in Auburn with family who were involved, as you said, in the Underground Railroad. Her grandmother and grandfather had a station, and her aunt and uncle had her great aunt and uncle had a station. And she grew up with Harriet Tubman's descendants in her town. That was important to her, and that was a really important part of her interest in international scouting What was it like for her? And do we know when the Scouts had a time when, because of the Jim Crow laws in the South, there was a move to segregate troops? How is there any knowledge about how she reacted to that, or how the Boston community reacted to the Eastern Massachusetts
Yes,
community?
we're very aware that Emma Hall, who started the troop in 1913, had a troop that was intermixed.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, so we know that Emma Hall, which is the first troop in Massachusetts, in the area of New Bedford that she welcomed all girls.
Mhm.
She was considered a do-gooder, and she started the first chapter of the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children in New Bedford. And when she got involved in Girl Scouts, she had made sure it was open to everyone. So we know from documents also that the board of New Bedford Girl Scouts was different religions, which was also very interesting. And we have photos through the 1920s that show the Red Rose Troop and other troops that started were racially diverse. You can tell by looking at the
Yes,
photos.
we have a 1917 photo of a drum and bugle group, and it's definitely integrated.
Right. And what we don't know, and there's been some researchers, and there's a woman writing a book, we don't really know the reaction with the Boston Society people as Girl Scouting grew in Massachusetts, and it grew very quickly.
Yes.
We see no comments that we know of from Helen. We know she embraced Emma Hall, and so it's a story that we know that eventually troops were segregated by religion and also many times by race. It was kind of in each community there were troops, but we don't know what Helen thought, but we know for a while, things were girls gathering, no matter what their race or religion, and then it's kind of murky. And as people say, they were keeping some things, but nobody was really documenting. A lot of the documentation, they were serving girls, and that's what they were doing. And Helen actually did a lot more of, like, some of the photos we have of the training camp were professional photographers.
Yes. Yeah.
Some staged. And, we have to infer from things kind of what was happening, but that's a really good question, Marnie.
Thank you, Marnie. We have a question. Do the Girl Scouts, the local Girl Scout camps at all, still do any English or any other folk dancing at all?
I don't know.
don't
They
know.
do. I'm sure we know they do dancing and have
Music.
music is a very important part, although it's much more of a struggle now to have that in troops and also have that at camp. But it's still, but I wouldn't say we know for sure about folk dancing per se.
And
We see it through the 50s, 60s, 70s. We have photos.
Like when my daughter was in a troop and I was a leader, we did dancing and songs.
Right.
But I'm too far removed from it now that I don't know. I can't answer that question.
It might not be music that we like.
Well, we do know that Marcy Van Cleve from the Folk Art Center of New England has been, and she's actually on the Zoom or was on the Zoom, has gone to Cedar Hill to teach folk dancing. International dancing. So yes. All right. So a couple more questions here. Someone wants to know, as someone that went to Bonnie Bray in Western Mass for years, did Helen Storrow ever visit there? Do you have any documentation?
No.
She probably did.
Yeah, but
Yeah, because it was all Girl Scouts of Eastern It was
It was all
Massachusetts Girl
Massachusetts Girl
Scouts.
Scouts. The whole state was
Right.
one council.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the photos of the early photos of folk dancing we included in the
It was
slideshow is at
Goofy.
Camp Green Erie, which was in Western Mass.
Yeah.
I would bet Helen could have gone to Bonnie Bray because she also did a lot in Western Massachusetts.
And at the Eastern States Exposition in
Yes.
Springfield. Yeah.
She started a place called Storrowton, which we didn't have time to include in the presentation, which is still there today as part of the Big E. And so she was all over the place with her car, and she drove it herself, and also her chauffeur drove her. So
Wow. All right, we have some more questions here, and we'll take a few more. But Melissa Zimmerman asks, can you touch on the Girl Scout author Edith Conant? Did she work for Girl Scouts USA in New York? And how are they related to Lily, if you know?
we don't know, but
don't
that's
know.
a good
Have to ask the
rabbit
Conant
hole to go
family.
down. So
Yeah,
say the
yeah.
name again, Edith Conant.
Edith Conant,
Okay.
Girl Scout author Edith Conant. So, all right. And Donald has their hand raised. Feel free to ask your question, Donald.
There. I tried to put it in the chat, but it vanished. So I have a question about the folk dancing that you referenced. Is that usually what we think of today as international folk dancing, but was this actually English country dancing? Was it American contra? Do you know?
I don't think it was American. I mean, like square dancing and all that. It was
Right.
what she learned from Cecil Sharp, and also being in England and developing that passion in her life, because she was always interested in music anyway, and she did pursue her studies in Germany. But folk dancing, she seemed to call it folk dancing.
Yeah. And we actually are not, we don't know that much about it. Like, we researched more because of the context of this presentation, but what we could find in the information was that she was and clearly from her dedication to Pinewoods Camp,
That
it
was her main interest
English
in
country
dance.
dancing, and then whatever Cecil was teaching people, the Morris dance, right? I really don't know.
Yeah, you mentioned Morris dancing, right?
No,
So that's what I figured. That it was English.
But we called it, like when the Girl Scouts did the rally, they called it folk dance. And what the rallies were, the troops would gather together and kind of compete in different areas. And that flag that we have, they called it folk dancing, whatever that meant in 1918, right?
Yeah.
So you all might know more. You might be able to help us add into that, but we don't actually, we mostly have pictures of bugling and drumming. We did not find a photo of any kind of dancing at a rally. It could be there in a file, but.
All right.
Yeah.
Good question.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the
Thank you.
presentation. It's been fabulous.
All right. We're going to do maybe 2 or 3 more questions. But I wanted to ask Jeremy Thorpe's question. Jeremy is on our Pinewoods cookbook. We are working on a Pinewoods cookbook for the centennial year. And Jeremy asks and says, there's a kitchen building listed on the map of Pine Tree Camp you shared with a date of 1920, uphill of the camp house where what we call the program office is. Do you know anything about when and how cooking was done there?
It was all outdoor. I don't believe they had like gas stoves or anything like that.
Right.
It was all wood fire.
What we do know, that map we shared was really created by Ed Wilfert. And what we started finding in the last few weeks even, and we've been working on this for a while, was Ed documented a lot of things that he was working on for the archives for you all, and also working with one of our co-founders, Pat Ross, to verify photos and identify photos. And just today, even, we found a whole nother file of photos and documentation. So there is more information So we could look for an answer for you. Because Ed was he was meticulous in what he
Yes.
could do, and he tried to recreate maps and documents to show what was. And I know his archival stuff, his archival documents and everything you have at UNH, I believe. But we have one of the things we will scan for you all is letters that he wrote to Pat Ross.
Yeah, they
They
had a
corresponded,
continuing correspondence. Yeah.
And you may find treasures in there that we don't know are treasures, because some of the things he was pursuing are he really was into the detail of the evolution of pine tree to pine woods. So
Great. Well, a couple of cool things. Jan Elliott, who is very involved with rapper dancing and sword dancing down on the Cape out of Woods Hole, said one year their local Girl Scouts did folk and Morris dancing and taught it to others at our chalet. So
Oh, wow,
yeah,
great.
that's really neat. And then someone else mentioned that they do hire square dance days at the Concord Scout House.
Uh-huh.
And Helen Storrow's article, Experiences in Dancing, written in 1938, is in its entirety available on our website. And we have more. See, this is all the things that you're learning here. And from the Girl Scout Manual, Camp Word Ho from 1920, a collection of English country dances by Cecil Sharp are dances that everyone can do and enjoy. So,
Great.
yes, right. And one of our former board members, Reagan Gill, said that there's also some Girl Scout stuff at UNH. And you have that already connected, if not.
know that it's there. We haven't. Now we have a lot of we got to come back down and see your camp. Well, Francine was there a long time ago. We got to go up there. It's just been fabulous to be able to collaborate, because there's so much to learn and so much of a connection.
And Peggy Conant says that she's never heard of Edith Conant, so perhaps no relation. So,
Okay.
And Mark H. hopes there is a college or grad student watching out there that will continue some of this research and write a paper or book. So, with that, thank you so much. Again, everyone, thank you. If you registered, we will automatically send you the link to this presentation. Again, look for it in about a week. And thank you so much, Francine and Lynn. This was absolutely fabulous. And if you didn't realize the background behind Francine and Lynn, that is all about Helen Storrow at the Girl Scout Museum at Cedar Hill. So be sure to reach out and go visit it. I know I am. So I look forward to meeting you in person. So thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. And everybody's invited. Make an appointment and come visit us.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And we will see you hopefully on March 25th for the Conant family and Pinewoods Camp. So thank you again and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.